Behind every war, there are heroes and victims. But there are also men who chose evil and who remained silent for years. These men you are about to hear participated in unspeakable crimes during World War II, looked terror in the eyes, and killed without remorse. Yet, some of them decided to speak. They decided to tell what they did, what they saw, what changed them forever. These are the words of repentant Nazi war criminals, uncomfortable, raw confessions that force us to confront the darkest truths of history. We are about to hear real testimonies, reminding us how important it is to raise awareness about the atrocities of war, understand the consequences of crimes, and never forget the human cost of violent suffering. First testimony, Oskar Groening, the accountant of Auschwitz. Oskar Groening was born on June 10, 1921, in Nienburg, Lower Saxony. He grew up in a rigidly nationalist family. His father, a skilled textile worker, had joined the Stahlhelm after Germany's defeat in World War I. Like many Germans of the time, he was bitter about the treatment imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1929, the family business went bankrupt. Groening described his childhood as marked by discipline, obedience, and authority. Military uniforms fascinated him from childhood. In 1940, at only 19, he volunteered for the SS. He believed he was serving his country, being part of something great. In September 1942, after training at the SS Economic Office in Berlin, he received orders for a secret destination. He had to sign a strict confidentiality declaration, promising not to reveal anything to family or friends. He boarded a train to a place he had never heard of, Auschwitz. When he arrived, he was told his banking skills would be useful. They took him to a barracks where prisoners' money was kept. They explained that when detainees were registered in the camp, their belongings were stored there and then returned when they left. But it soon became clear that Auschwitz was not a normal internment camp. The money taken from deported Jews was never returned. Groening's task was simple: count the money, catalog valuable items, guard the luggage of people destined for death. He was, as he described decades later, a cog in the machine. But he was a conscious cog. He testified to hearing screams from the gas chambers. He said he saw a comrade kill a baby in front of its mother, throwing it against a truck. He said that episode deeply disturbed him, but he did nothing to stop it. He could not. Or perhaps he did not want to risk himself. For over 40 years, Groening lived a normal life. He returned to Germany, married, worked, built a family. He never spoke of Auschwitz. But in the late 1980s, when he began hearing Holocaust denial, something in him broke. People claimed the gas chambers never existed, that it was all invented, and he who had been there, who had seen, decided to speak. In 2005, he gave a series of interviews to the BBC, describing in detail what he had seen and done at Auschwitz. He spoke of trains arriving with Hungarian Jews, of the selections, of smoke rising from the crematoria. He admitted his moral guilt. "I feel I must share total responsibility for everything that happened. I was morally contaminated inescapably. Since I failed at the time, I still feel personally responsible for Auschwitz today." His own words, however, condemned him. These interviews drew the attention of German prosecutors. In 2014, at 93, Groening was charged as an accomplice in the murder of 300,000 Jews at Auschwitz. His trial in Lüneburg in 2015 was one of the last major trials of Nazi criminals. During the trial, survivors of Auschwitz testified. Some accused him angrily. Others, surprisingly, recognized the value of his testimony against deniers. Susan Pollock, deported from Hungary and separated from her mother upon arrival at the camp, said, "The terror still freezes my soul." At arrival, it was like a terror that paralyzes every faculty. Groening was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He never served them. He died on March 9, 2018, at 96, before the sentence became enforceable. His testimony remains controversial. Many historians argue his repentance was not genuine, that he only sought to build a better image. Others note he spoke of Auschwitz as if describing another Oskar Groening, separating the man he had been from the man he became. Yet, his words have undeniable historical value. They are the documented confession of an SS member admitting the regime's crimes, confirming what deniers still try to erase today. Groening once said, "The screams of those in the gas chambers never left me. I never returned to Auschwitz because of my sense of shame." Second testimony, Albert Speer, the architect of the Third Reich. Albert Speer was a different case. He was not a soldier on the front line. He had never fired a shot. He was an architect, a technocrat, a man fascinated by form, beauty, and power. Born on March 19, 1905 in Mannheim, Speer grew up in a wealthy middle-class German family. He studied architecture in Munich and Berlin, becoming an assistant to Professor Heinrich Tessenow at the Technische Hochschule in Charlottenburg. In 1931, at 26, he heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time during a speech to students and professors at the University of Berlin. Speer was fascinated. It was not politics that drew him, but Hitler's magnetic personality. He wrote in his memoirs, "I was not choosing the National Socialist Party, I was becoming a follower of Hitler, whose magnetic force reached me the first time I saw him and never let me go." He joined the party in January 1931. His career was meteoric. Hitler, who considered himself a failed architect and had a passion for art and architecture, found in Speer a talented and devoted young man. He appointed him his personal architect, entrusting him with increasingly ambitious projects: the renovation of the Reich Chancellery, the design of the grounds for party rallies in Nuremberg, the planning of a new monumental Berlin that would be called Germania. In 1942, after the death of Armaments Minister Fritz Todt in a plane crash, Hitler appointed Speer Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer became the second most powerful man in the Reich. He organized German industrial production during the war, managed millions of forced laborers, built underground factories producing V-2 rockets. He kept the German war machine running even when all seemed lost. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, Speer stood out from the other defendants. He did not deny, justify, or shift responsibility. He admitted his guilt. He said he had been blinded by ambition, by his devotion to Hitler, by his desire to realize grand projects. He told the tribunal, "I must share total responsibility for everything that happened. I was inescapably morally contaminated." Speer claimed he did not know about the Holocaust, had never visited extermination camps, had been too focused on war production to realize the horror around him. Many did not believe him. Historians later found evidence that Speer knew much more than he admitted. Matthias Schmidt, in his 1982 book, Albert Speer, The End of a Myth, and biographer Gitta Serini showed that Speer had been informed of atrocities, but chose not to know, turning a blind eye. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison for using forced labor in armaments factories. He served them in Spandau Prison in Berlin from 1946 to 1966. During those years, he wrote over 2,000 pages of personal memoirs. After release, using archival documents, he turned those writings into an autobiography, Erinnerungen, published in German in 1969 and translated into English the following year as Inside the Third Reich. The book became an international bestseller. The New York Times called it not only the most significant personal German account to emerge from the war, but the most revealing document on the Hitler phenomenon ever written. Speer provided an inside look at Hitler's inner circle, the mechanisms of the Nazi regime, the personalities of the hierarchy: Goebbels, Göring, Himmler, Bormann. But his memoirs were also strongly criticized. British historian Richard J. Evans and many others noted that Speer had omitted too much, constructing the image of a good Nazi, an apolitical technocrat swept along by events. Barbara Miller Lane, in 1973, wrote, "Scholars have noted so many gaps in his account of his ministry's workings as to cast considerable doubt on the whole." Speer spent the rest of his life balancing the role of public penitent and memorialist. He wrote other books, gave interviews, became wealthy. But he never completely freed himself from his past. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Since I failed at the time, I still feel personally responsible for Auschwitz in a wholly personal sense." He died on September 1st, 1981, in London during a trip. He was 76. His repentance remains a subject of historical debate. Was it sincere or merely a strategy for moral survival? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. What remains are his words, an ambiguous testament of a man complicit in a criminal regime who spent the rest of his life trying to convince himself and others he was not a true criminal. Third testimony, Karl Plagge, the officer who saved 1,240 Jews. Not all repentant Nazis spoke after the war. Some acted while the war was still ongoing, risking their own lives to save others. One of these was Karl Plagge. Born on July 10, 1897 in Darmstadt, Germany, Plagge was an engineer. He fought in World War I and returned home convinced that Germany needed a national revival. In 1931, like many Germans, he joined the National Socialist Party, believing in Hitler's social and economic promises. He graduated in engineering from the Technical University of Darmstadt in 1924. But Plagge was not a fanatic. When he began teaching, he refused to spread Nazi racial theories. As a man of science, he did not believe them. His refusal cost him dearly. In 1935, he was accused by the local party leadership of being a friend of Jews and Freemasons and was removed from his leadership positions in the local party apparatus. At the outbreak of war, in September 1939, Plagge was recalled to the Wehrmacht with the rank of captain. He was put in charge of a military vehicle repair workshop in Darmstadt. In June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Plagge was transferred to Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, to command the HKP 562, a repair and maintenance unit for army vehicles. What he saw in Vilnius shocked him. The Jewish population of the city, about 60,000 people, had been confined to a ghetto. The German Einsatzgruppen, with the collaboration of Lithuanian militias, were conducting mass executions. In July 1941, 5,000 Jewish men were rounded up and executed in the forest near the village of Ponary. Plagge testified after the war, "When I arrived in Poland, I saw unimaginable things I could not bear. I decided then and there to work against the Nazis. I could not stop the killings, but I could do something." HKP 562 employed civilian workers, including Jews from the ghetto. Plagge began issuing work certificates to as many Jews as possible, declaring them essential for the war economy. Many of them had no technical skills. They were hairdressers, shoemakers, butchers, but Plagge employed them anyway. He also produced false certificates to save Jews from prison and transfer them to his workshops. Plagge ensured that his men treated Jewish workers with humanity and respect. He prohibited violence against civilians, Jews, Poles, or anyone else. He kept fanatical Nazis away from his unit. Alfred Stumpf, one of his lieutenants, said, "Mr. Plagge treated Jews very civilly and humanely and expected his subordinates to do the same." In August 1943, when deportations from the Vilnius ghetto to Estonia began, Plagge obtained permission from the SS to evacuate over 1,000 of his Jewish workers and their families from the ghetto. He transferred them to a hastily set-up labor camp in 2 residential blocks on Suboc Street, about 1.3 kilometers from the main HKP workshops. He insisted that wives and children accompany the men, arguing that only this way could he keep the Jewish workers motivated. In this way, he saved entire families from deportation and death. Plagge ensured his workers did not suffer from hunger. He provided firewood so they would not die from cold, doctors so they would not get sick, rations higher than the starvation allotments given by the SS. Pearl Good, a surviving child of HKP 562, recalled, "He was a very special man. He was always fair." But in the spring of 1944, prisoners learned through a clandestine radio that the Red Army was advancing toward Vilnius. They were convinced the SS would kill them all before the Soviets arrived. They began preparing to escape and building hiding places in the camp. Plagge could no longer protect them. He had to leave Vilnius and hand his Jewish workers over to the SS. Before leaving, on July 1, 1944, he made a last attempt to help them survive. He gathered them under the watchful eye of SS Oberscharführer Richter, the SS representative in the camp. He told them that the Wehrmacht was leaving Vilnius, and that from that moment they would be the responsibility of the SS, adding, "And you all know how well the SS takes care of their Jewish prisoners." The prisoners understood the warning. For many, it was a signal to hide or escape. 2 days later, on July 3, 1944, the SS arrived at the camp to liquidate it. 500 prisoners who presented themselves for roll call were taken to Ponary and shot. Another 250 were found in hiding places and killed in the camp yard. But when the Red Army captured Vilnius a few days later, about 250 Jews emerged from their hiding places. This group represents the largest single group of Holocaust survivors in Vilnius. Of a pre-war Jewish population of 60,000, only 2,000 survived. The largest group was saved by Plague. After the war, Plague returned to Darmstadt. In 1947, he was tried by an Allied denazification tribunal. To the court's surprise, surviving Jews of HKP 562 came to testify on his behalf, describing his tireless efforts to save them. Plague was classified as a fellow traveler of the Nazi Party, whose rescue activities had been undertaken for humanitarian reasons rather than open opposition to Nazism. He was acquitted. But Plaga never sought recognition for his actions. He was tormented by the fact that he could not save everyone. He rarely spoke about his experiences. He died on June 19,195-7 in Darmstadt at 59, anonymously. It was only after his death that the full scope of his heroism came to light. Survivors and their children sought him out for years, wanting to thank him, wanting the world to know. In 2005, after a long, detailed investigation, Yad Vashem, the official Holocaust memorial in Israel, posthumously recognized Karl Plague as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Plaga was not a perfect hero. He had joined the Nazi Party, fought for the Wehrmacht, been part of the system. But he made a different choice. He had seen evil and decided to oppose it within the limits of possibility, knowing that every life saved was an act of resistance against the machine of death. These three stories we have heard represent three different ways of confronting guilt. Groening spoke to fight denial, but did so too late when he was old and his life had been built on silence. Speer spoke to construct a narrative of repentance, but many historians doubt his sincerity. Plague acted while there was still time to save lives and then lived in silence without seeking glory. It is not about redeeming these men. It is not about forgiveness. It is about understanding that within a totalitarian, criminal, genocidal regime, there were margins of choice. Some chose active evil, others chose indifference, which is a form of complicity. And others, few, chose to do something. Their testimonies are important, not because they tell us Nazis were human. We already know that. They are important because they show us the complexity of moral responsibility in extreme times. They remind us that true repentance requires not only words, but actions. And they warn us that silence, indifference, the choice to not see, has concrete consequences, measurable in lost lives. Today, 80 years after the end of the war, the voices of survivors are fading. Also, the voices of perpetrators, repentant or not, are almost all gone, but their words remain, recorded, archived, transcribed. Not to justify, not to forget, but to remember that behind every uniform there was a person making choices, and those choices had consequences. This is a warning. Because history does not end when books are closed, it ends when we stop listening to the voices of those who lived it, for better or worse. And when we stop asking ourselves, what would we have done in their place? And what are we doing today, when we see injustices, discrimination, dehumanization of others? Write in the comments if these regrets seem genuine to you. See you in the next video.